Hi friends, today we're doing Unit 10, Lesson 15, The Road to Revolution, Part 2. We're going to start by going over the key vocabulary words you'll be hearing in today's reading. Our first word is boycott, to refuse to buy, to reject, or prohibit. Our next word is independence, freedom, the state of not being controlled by or dependent upon another entity or person. Then we have the word issues, problems, difficulties, obstacles, disagreements. Next we have tension, pressure, worry, stress, or nervousness. And our last word is unjust, which means unfair or not right. We are now going to move into today's reading. Chapter 20, The Road to Revolution, Part 2. As you have heard, the colonists were in strong opposition to the taxes Great Britain kept heaping on them. Their famous words were, "No taxation without representation." Our caption here says, Patrick Henry before the House of Burgesses speaking against tax. One man in particular, Patrick Henry, began to speak up. Patrick Henry was a Virginia lawyer. In Williamsburg, Virginia, he stood before the House of Burgesses and spoke out against the king and the new tax. Patrick Henry stated that only colonial government should have the power to introduce new taxes in the colonies. In 1765, the 27 elected leaders of 9 colonies made their way to New York. They met to discuss what could be done about the Stamp Act. This meeting became known as the Stamp Act Congress. Members of the Congress informed the British Parliament that this tax was unjust. Another outspoken leader at this time was a man named Samuel Adams from Massachusetts. He organized a group of people who became known as the Sons of Liberty. These men protested in the streets, burned the stamps, and threatened the agents whose job it was to collect the taxes. It soon became impossible to impose the Stamp Act, and so, in 1766, the British Parliament was forced to repeal it. When the colonists heard this news, they celebrated their victory. Members of Parliament were not happy. King George insisted that it was Britain's right to tax the colonies. This caption says, Sons of Liberty protesting. They're protesting using signs that say, "Down with stamp taxes" and "No Stamp Act." A new plan was needed. This time a man named Charles Townshend had another idea. They would put a tax on items that they knew the colonists really needed. These items, which were used daily in colonial times to make many things, included paint, paper, glass, lead, tea, wool, and silk. In response, the colonists decided to boycott these items from Britain. They began to make their own products. Colonists purchased tea from other sources or drank Liberty tea made from herbs and berries. Many women even began making their own cloth. This hurt British manufacturers, and before long this tax was also removed. That is, all except for the tax on tea. So the colonists' boycott of British tea continued. Alarmed by the level of protests, Britain sent troops to the colonies. They arrived in Boston Harbor in 1768. The colonists did not like the presence of British soldiers, especially because the soldiers had been sent to control them. Tension between the colonists and Britain continued to grow. In 1770, a scuffle or brief fight broke out in Boston between British soldiers and a group of colonists. In the confusion, British soldiers fired their guns into the crowd and killed 5 colonists, injuring 6 others. The first to die was a man named Crispus Attucks. People were horrified. The soldiers were immediately arrested. This terrible event became known as the Boston Massacre. The relationship between the colonists and Britain was becoming much worse. This caption here says Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks. It would not be fair to say that tea caused the American Revolution, but it played a part. The colonists were still refusing to buy tea from Britain, and King George and his government were refusing to listen to the colonists. In 1773, the British Parliament introduced a new law called the Tea Act. This time, they said that only the British East India Company could sell tea to the colonies, and the tea would still be taxed. The colonists responded that not only did they not want this tea, they didn't want trade ships bringing it into the colonies either. In other words, they would give up drinking British tea altogether. In 1773, 3 British trade ships loaded with tea appeared in the Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty took action. Wearing elements of Native American war clothing, they threw all of the tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. This is an image here of them dumping all the tea off of the boat that came into the harbor. It was called the Boston Tea Party. Now the king was really mad. You could say the colonists' actions spoke louder than their words. The British government decided to punish this colony. A British general was placed in control of Massachusetts. Boston Harbor was closed, and more British soldiers were sent to Boston. With the port closed, many colonial businesses began to suffer. The colonists called these The colonists called these recent British decisions the Intolerable Acts because they were not willing to put up with them. Rather than back down, the colonists began to join together. Many colonists were even more convinced now that the British did not understand them or care about them. Colonists were now daring to think about and talk about establishing their independence from England and becoming their own nation. Those who wanted to become independent or free of England were called patriots. People still loyal to England and the king were known as loyalists. It was clear that the colonists' relationship with Britain was changing, and elected leaders of the colonies had to decide what to do. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and other leaders came together for a gathering in Philadelphia known as the First Continental Congress. In this meeting, the leaders voted to end all trade with Britain until Britain repealed the Intolerable Acts. Most people still hoped that these issues could be resolved peacefully. However, it was decided that each colony should begin to store weapons and train men for war. On April 18, 1775, British soldiers were given information about colonial weapons that had been secretly stored in a town called Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. This is an image of the Founding Fathers: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and Hancock. The soldiers were ordered to seize the weapons and destroy them. The British soldiers began to march towards Concord. A colonist named Paul Revere rode through the night to inform his fellow patriots that the British were coming. Perhaps you are familiar with this first part of the famous poem called Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, based on this historic event. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. Paul Revere saw the signal of 2 lanterns lit by his friend in the church tower. That meant the British were coming by sea, so he rode all night to Concord to warn the colonists. Although Paul Revere was captured, the colonial soldiers, called Minutemen, were warned and prepared for the arrival of the British. This is an image of Paul Revere's ride. The very first shots of the American Revolution were fired in Lexington on April 19, 1775, as the British soldiers were on their way to Concord. Historians are not certain who fired the first shot. Several Minutemen died in this exchange of fire. The British soldiers continued their march toward Concord. However, when they got there, the weapons were nowhere to be found. Paul Revere's heroic ride had warned the colonists in time for them to move their weapons. The British began to retreat. As they did, they were fired upon by Minutemen. Many British soldiers were killed. A second gathering of leaders from each colony was called in the city of Philadelphia, which would later become the first capital of the United States. Shortly before this meeting, Patrick Henry had uttered these famous words: I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. At this Second Continental Congress, George Washington was chosen to be the commander-in-chief in charge of an army that did not yet fully exist, but which the leaders anticipated they would soon need. This is the Declaration of Independence on the left and the Stars and Stripes colonial flag on the right. During this time, many letters and petitions were sent to King George. Among them was the Declaration of Independence, primarily penned by Thomas Jefferson and approved by the Founding Fathers on July 4, 1776. This term, primarily penned means it was primarily written by Thomas Jefferson. King George responded by ignoring the colonists' requests and sending more British soldiers to the colonies. The long and difficult battle for American independence had begun. You may now move on to Unit 10, Lesson 15, Google Form.